You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. I hope you're having a great day and off to a good start for the day or wherever you might be on the clock listening to this. My name is Doug Thorpe, and this is another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. In today's show, we're going to do a little more focus on a segment of good leadership practice, and that has to do with leaders being coaches for their people. My guest is someone who's done a lot of work in this space, among many other things. She's a very accomplished coach and leadership development expert. Her name is Kim Ades. And Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's definitely one of my favorite topics.
I was talking with Kim in the green room before we got started here, and I was questioning her. In her beautifully written bio, there's a phrase that people find interest in her quirky coaching style, and I asked her to help us understand what that was. And Kim, tell everybody what you told me.
Well, one of the things is about me is that I'm extremely direct. So I don't hold any punches and I call it for what it is. So very often I will say, that's bullshit. Or I will use very strange analogies that to help people understand what they're doing and how what they're doing doesn't necessarily align with what they want. And so I use all kinds of tools, techniques, language to really drive a message home. And a lot of people find that it's a bit quirky sometimes.
Well, I can imagine and I've had my own experience in certain corporate settings in particular, who try to kind of assert some sort of culture or demeanor in their coaching style. When you kind of hit them on the side with something way off of what they usually deal with or how people have learned to interact with them as leaders, it does kind of catch them off guard and makes them think.
Well, and it's not the intention isn't to like hit anybody over the head, but it's really to help individuals look at things from a very, very different perspective, because we're used to looking at things in one way. And sometimes that one way, when we keep looking at things the same way over and over again, we tend to get the same results. And so my job is to help people look at the same thing from a very different lens. And in order to do that, we need to approach it a little differently. We need to turn it upside down. We need to filter that lens with a different color or with a different frame. And so that is what I do. And that's my skill set, specifically that.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you. And as one of my guests recently said, in the process of leadership development, sometimes we need to unlearn as much as we need to learn.
You betcha. That is so true. Oh my gosh. And it's difficult to unlearn. And the reason why it's difficult to unlearn is because what we know to be true is held firmly by a set of beliefs we have. And sometimes those beliefs really contradict or clash with our desires. And so not only do we need to unlearn what we know, we need to really look at those beliefs and challenge them so that they let something new in.
Right. Well, and I think that is such a powerful opportunity for those of us in the coaching world and those that are working to help build future leaders. A lot of that is that shaping and learning and reframing away from those beliefs that may be taking you down the wrong path or not the optimum path. The thing you so strongly believe in, the results might be okay. They might be good, but are they great? And, can they be better?
Are they optimal?
Are they optimal? That's
yes,
right.
You're right.
Good way to say it. Well, let's get on to the topic that I teased out at the start, this notion of leaders being coaches, not just having a coach, but themselves learning how to be more of a coach for their people. Where do you start with that with people, Kim?
Well, The first thing that we need to do when we talk about this subject is actually, I don't want to use the word convince, but build a case for coaching as a leadership strength. In fact, build a case for coaching as a key leadership strategy. And that's the first place, because I think a lot of leaders think, okay, like, yeah, I got a coach, but it's such a time consuming activity. There are so many more important things I need to do. I need to work on strategy. I need to work on revenue generation. I need to work on product development. I need to work on all these things. And, this is not exactly what I signed up for when I built my company, when I started. And now I have to like slow myself down in order to coach people. And can't they just get it right? Can't they just do what they need to do? And so what I see from the very beginning is quite a substantial amount of resistance on the part of leaders to step into a coaching role and to truly acquire critical coaching skills. So that's where we begin. We begin by building a case. And so what I want to say about that is we've done tons of research on this one subject. And the subject is, what's the relationship between the coaching skills of a leader and the performance of their teams? And we literally asked that question to like hundreds and hundreds of leaders. Number one, how would you rate your coaching skills, and how satisfied are you with the performance of your team? And the first thing we found was that leaders who are confident and feel strongly about their coaching skills and make it a priority are dramatically more satisfied with the results and the productivity and the delivery of their team. But let's go one step further. Leaders who take on coaching skills, when you learn to coach, it's not only a new skill you're developing, but there's an aspect of it that really builds your own, it's a personal development journey that you're on. And what we find is that leaders who focus on their own personal development are also much more substantially satisfied in their roles. And what we also find is leaders who commit to their own personal development have more loyal teams, less turnover, less sick days, more inspiration, more productivity, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's a funny thing, right? We're only focusing on the leader here. But when the leader shows up more inspired, more clear, more with greater guidance, with greater clarity, with greater coaching skills, the team functions at a much higher level. And so the first thing we need to do is build that case and help leaders understand, hey, this isn't just a frivolous activity. This isn't just something we do because, it's good, it's humanitarian, it's touchy-feely, it's all woo-woo, right? People like that, it makes them feel good. No, we do it because there's an ROI. And the ROI is tangible and it's real and it's both emotional, but it's also very much nuts and bolts. It's also very much related to profit margins.
Right. Well, I go back as you were describing that. Allow me, if you will, to go to a very basic example. Let's take the individual that has this wonderful idea and wants to build a company around it. So they've got this vision, they've got this set of values, principles, beliefs that are going to, change the world. Here's what we're going to do. Well, as you start building a team to help you execute on that, the very first challenge is communicating that vision with the team, getting them to, as the old joke goes, drink the Kool-Aid, join you in that journey. And I've seen many of an entrepreneur who fails right at that first step.
Yes.
They've got the deeply embedded vision, but also they've got a belief, back to your other statement, that nobody can do it like I do it. And you're saying I come in and into these situations as a coach going, wait a minute, what do you mean nobody can do it like you do it? Have you tried explaining it to anybody? Have you tried sharing it with people? You
right.
might
But
just
also,
be pleasantly surprised.
But also is that how you want to live your life so that you're taking on the responsibility, right? All the time, full time. Like that's a lot of heavy lifting. But I always want to ask the question. So when nobody else can do it as well as you, what's in it for you? What's the win? What's the gain? Yeah, you feel good about yourself. That's like a bit of an ego boost, right? Yeah, I'm good. I can do it better than anyone else. But there's a huge cost to that, right? There's a huge limitation associated with that point of view. And that's not going to allow you to grow. So the belief, right? We're going back to beliefs. The belief that you're better than everyone else actually really slows you down. It doesn't help you
Well,
become the leader you need to be.
and it's not scalable. If you think you want to build this wonderful enterprise that has, some giant 7, 8 digit multiple associated with it, for some future revenue event, you're not going to scale to that if that's the only way you want to go at it.
That's exactly right. It's a problem. We can't think that way, right? So
Right.
what I like to do is I like to look at how leaders think and how their thinking affects what they do, what they don't do, and how they do everything they do to understand the results that they're getting. And when they're not getting the results they want, we come back full circle to their belief systems and their thinking.
Right. Right. Well, and along that line, I'll ask you, a popular buzzword in modern business leadership today is this whole idea of emotional intelligence. Where do you see that fit in what you do with clients?
So I think that emotional intelligence is one of the most critical skill sets that a leader can have. However, what we have discovered is that leaders who are, let's call it above and beyond the typical leader, leaders who achieve extraordinary results, have a very, very high degree of what we call emotional resilience. It's different from emotional intelligence. They go hand in hand, but it's a little bit different. So, what is emotional resilience? Emotional resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity with speed and agility, and this is the extra piece, and leverage the adversity somehow, turn it into an advantage. And so, what's required for that to take place is a completely different approach, a mindset, a different frame of mind, for lack of better words, in how we receive, process, interpret, and react to adversity. And so those people who don't have a high degree of emotional resilience, they fall, they get hit, they stay down for a while. And not only do they stay down, they beat themselves up for the adversity that just took place. Those people who have emotional resilience, they get hit, they fall down, and then they say, how can I make this work for me? How can this turn into a gift for me? And so they very quickly pivot in their thinking to looking for the advantage. And that's a different way of operating. When we look at that in terms of emotional resilience and we compare that with emotional intelligence, or we combine that with emotional intelligence, we get a superior level leader. Like we get someone who's operating on a whole different level.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me, I had a guest recently who wrote a book called The Mentally Strong Leader. His name is Steve Motz. And in that book, what he describes is something similar to that. I don't think he uses that term, the emotional resilience, but he too just says emotional intelligence is just one of many elements that make up the mentally strong leader. And part of that mental strength is it is resilience. It's the ability to rebound, bounce back, and take advantage of what might have happened. And one thing that he talked about that I really like a lot is the question, what's your relationship with fear, risk, and doubt? Because fear and doubt are very human emotions. Risk is more tangible in most cases, but sometimes it's only perceived. It's not real. It's a perceived risk so it becomes kind of an emotion. And he makes the argument that we do need to change our mindset about our relationship with those elements because there's always going to be a relationship there. The question is, what do you want to do with it?
Yes, it's interesting. I do a lot of presenting. I speak with a lot of leaders and executives, CEOs, and we do talk about this concept of perceived risk. And where does perceived risk come from? What is that really about? It's about our belief system that says, that doesn't feel safe. And it's a misinterpretation of the risk, right?
Right.
So they will stop themselves from doing a whole bunch of things because it may lead to an embarrassing outcome, or they may not perform as well as they would like to in front of others. So it's very much tied to the ego as well. And so a lot of times they will not take an action or not jump on an opportunity for fear of failure when that failure really is a low cost experience.
Right. Right. And and often when we look at situations that are getting ready to happen, I don't know what it is about the human psyche, but there's often, not always, but often a propensity to make it much worse than it's really going to be. And as Mark Twain famously said one time, my life has been a series of horrible tragedies, most of which never happened.
That's
And
right. That's right.
you think it, and you ramp up
Anticipate it.
for it, you get spun up for it, and then the event happens, and you go, "Oh, that wasn't bad at all." That was pretty good.
Exactly, exactly right. There's a story I tell. Is it okay if I share the
Please,
story?
please.
Yeah, there's a story I tell when I speak, and it's a story of a guy named Paul Richard Evans. No. Anyway, this guy, he wrote a book, and the book is called The Christmas Box. And one day he just decided to write this story, and he gave it to his wife and he said, "Can you please take a look at this story? And do you think that our daughters, he had two daughters at the time, would enjoy this story?" And she read the book and she said, "You know what? It's a really good book. You should print it out and we should give it to like a whole bunch of family and friends for Christmas. I think they'd really like it." And so he printed up a bunch of copies of his book, literally in print copy, and he handed them out. And shortly thereafter, he started getting emails from people, not only the people he gave the book to, but their friends and family members too, saying, "I loved your story. You should get it published." And he got so many comments of that nature that he decided to try to get it published. And he sent his book out to all the publishers he could find. And every last one of them said, "No, thank you. There's no market for a Christmas book. Nobody reads that stuff. Like, that's just not a thing that people buy." And he was really, really discouraged. But his wife was very, very strongly in favor of, she was very supportive. And so she said, "Why don't we self-publish? We'll just self-publish the book." And so he got a whole bunch of copies made. And on the weekends, he would put the books in his station wagon and he would go from bookstore to bookstore and library to library and do book signing events. And some days he would sell a few books and some days not so many. And one day he got an email from the American Booksellers Association. And they said, "Well, we're hosting an event in your city. We're having a trade show. Would you be interested in buying a trade show booth? We're going to have 10 to 15,000 people in attendance. You'll get a lot of exposure." And he kind of did the math and he said, "Well, you know what? I need to sell about 80 books in order to break even. So I'll do it." And he bought a booth and he got a fancy sign and he went to the trade show and he went and he sat there and he waited and he waited and he waited, but there was no traffic. Not for him, not for the booth beside him, not for the booth in front of him. It was dead. And he got frustrated. He said, "I don't understand. They told me that there would be 15 to 20, whatever, 10 to 15,000 people in attendance. Where are all the people?" And so he got up from his chair and he said, "I'm going to go find the people." And he left. It was a big conference hall. And so he went and he followed the noise and he found this huge, huge hall filled from the front of the room to the back of the room full of people. And he said, "What is going on here?" And he went in and he got a better look at what was going on inside. And he noticed that there was a head table at the front of the room. And at that head table were all the famous authors. And they were sitting there and people were lined up to buy their books and get them signed. And he said, "Man, people didn't come to go to the trade show. Nobody's interested in that. They came to see these famous authors. And at this rate, I'll never succeed." And he moved in and he wanted to get a better look at who was sitting at the head table. And he noticed that there was an empty seat at the head table. So he went back to his trade show floor. He picked up two boxes of books and he went and he sat down in that empty chair. Shortly thereafter, a line started to form and people were buying his book and he was signing. buy sign, buy sign, right? That's how it was going. And about 20 minutes later, a security guard appeared and his heart was beating super fast. Like he's like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble now. The security guard approached him and said, "Would you like some water?" And he said, "Sorry, I'm late." And she let him stay. And again, true story. Richard Paul Evans is his name. And he ended up getting a book deal the following year. In fact, there was a bidding war for this book deal, and Simon and Schuster won the book bidding war, and they paid him a $4 million advance to
Wow.
publish the book after that. So the question I often ask is, did he take a risk?
Yeah.
Was that a risk?
I would argue in a literal sense of how you might define risk, there were several in that story.
That's interesting. What were the so he took a risk by going to the trade show, by buying a booth.
Well, yeah. He made the financial decision to spend the money to get the booth. So arguably that's a risk. And if I'm running a business and somebody tells me you're going to need to spend $1,500 to get a booth, I'm going to do the math on, how many units am I going to have
Yep.
to sell to break even? Do I perceive that there's an opportunity to do much more than that? And maybe not literally in those unit sales, but expanding my brand and my message. And
Right.
so, yeah, but yeah, I think
But
technically,
did sitting in that chair, was that a risk?
sure.
But what was the risk?
Well, I think whether you call it socially or morally or even legally, he had not been invited to have one of those chairs, but he took it.
He took it.
So,
There was an opportunity. He came in, he was an unknown author, right? He took the seat. He what was the actual risk? The actual risk was he could have been kicked out and he would
right,
have left still an unknown author. No
exactly.
change. So what happens is we misperceive risk. We evaluate risk based on, how am I going to feel? Am I going to feel embarrassed? Will I get kicked out? Will it hurt my emotions? Will it hurt my, ego? Will it hurt me? Will I
Well,
leave feeling shame?
right. And that's where I was going. I think, starting with a literal interpretation of how do you define risk, forget the emotions and feelings for a minute, but just literally what would be the parameters
Yeah.
around that? Well, he's trespassing to grab that seat. Now, is somebody going to prosecute him for it and all that? Probably not. To your point, you might just get kicked out. But then you get into that emotional realm of, am I going to feel embarrassed or
Right. Right. And
right,
and trespassing is an interesting term, right? It's not like, he was legally allowed to be in the room. He wasn't invited to be in the seat. So like we're now getting into semantics, but the my point is that we tend to overblow the emotional factor of risk.
totally agree.
And
Totally
so
agree.
then because of that, we don't grab opportunities that are in front of us. We don't make a move. We stay in our corner. We play smaller than we might play otherwise because of the emotional factor, because we don't like the conception of getting our hands slapped, right? And so we don't take action very often. And so I notice when I have a conversation with leaders about this particular story, they feel that he took a massive risk. But when we really analyze it and boil it down, like what exactly was the risk? What was the potentially negative outcome that could have happened? He would have been removed from the premises. Okay.
Yeah. I do that a lot in my coaching when I have a client that starts mapping out this horrible situation they're facing or anticipating gloom and doom. I often challenge them to say, okay, all that may be true, but what is the worst that would happen?
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
what
Perfect.
have you asked yourself the question, what is the absolute worst that could happen? And most of the time, 99% of the time, nobody says, well, I'm going to get fired, or I'm going to tank this deal, or I'm going to blow things up. It's not that at all. It's something like, oh, we'll live another day. The sun will come up tomorrow.
That's right. That's right.
And so I'm going, then, okay, if that's true, then why are you so worried about it?
Right. Well, and one of the things that I do with a lot of clients is I have them do a three-part exercise when they're worried about something. Part one is imagine the worst thing happens and write that down. What does that look like? How bad could it be? Write it out. Like write the worst case scenario right here. Now I ask them to write a second. I ask my clients to journal, right? That's part of what we do. So the second journal is now write what it looks like when you recover from the worst case scenario. So imagine recovery. Like play that out in your mind. What are you doing right after the big failure happens? Now put those both aside and imagine great success. What does that look like? And what I find is that when people can perceive and envision a recovery from failure, they don't worry so much about failure. They can put it aside because they got that, right? They already have a strategy. They already have a way. They've already prepared for it. They've already played it through in their minds. And now they can put that on the back burner and totally focus on their success.
Let me ask you this: in all of your work, you've alluded several times to studies and surveys and work you've done analyzing these things. Do you find a significant difference between the gender role in leadership? A male leader versus a female leader of equal level in the way they look at these things.
I think that, there's not a lot of difference. There's one little difference is that women tend to want to, I don't want to say fix, but they tend to take more on. Like they tend to take it on personally a lot more. So they tend to be the ones to say, okay, fine, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. So they don't push back and put things on others. They take it on a little bit more. And so what I find is that a lot of women leaders have a higher degree of stress than men, in the sense of just having a super heavy workload. They're not doing great at taking care of themselves because they're very, very busy taking care of everybody and everything else around them.
That's interesting. And I wonder if that correlates. I asked the question because several years ago, I was working on a very large project, and I had a female executive tell me that there was a situation going on, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but there's a situation going on, and it did involve a female executive on my client side. But this female executive I was working with, she came to me and she said, "Doug, you're looking at this all wrong." And I said, "How so?" And she said, you're missing one key element here. She said, female executives operate with a much higher fear of failing than male executives do. Male executives tend to be, and this comes down to a relationship with risk. Male executives tend, and very broad generalization here, but they tend to look at risk and say, if I fail, I'll get up tomorrow. I'll be okay. We'll figure this out. It's not going to be the end of the world. But her argument was female executives in general have more fear of failing and therefore approach risk-based decisions differently.
That's super interesting. I would say to you, like, if I look at the people I work with, they tend to struggle in 4 key areas. And in one of these areas, I noticed a slightly bigger distinction, and I'll share with you those areas. Number one is the leaders we work with tend to feel a sense of isolation. And what that boils down to is they have a huge sense of responsibility. They have a lot they need to take care of, and they don't feel that there's anyone out there that is safe for them to talk to and open up to and share and be vulnerable. They have a trust issue, right? They don't trust. And they have reasons for that. They have evidence to suggest that when they've trusted people in the past, it kind of backfired. So they've learned, I've got to be careful, I've got to be cautious. So they feel a sense of isolation.
Isolation, yeah.
The second thing is that they are people who tend to have what we call friction with others. And we see 2 kinds of friction. One is overt conflict, right? there's yelling, there's screaming, there's anger, there's disappointment. Like it's tangible or it's palpable. We hear it, see it, it's clear. But then there's another kind of tension we see, which is more covert tension, where the leader will observe somebody else doing something and the leader will say, I don't have time for this, or it's just too much. I don't know what to do with this right now, and I have a million other things to do. And so what happens is it builds up this big, huge level of resentment. And what we see is when you compare men to women, women definitely have a higher degree of covert tension than men. Let's continue, right? So we see that distinction. The third thing is that these are people who tend to have what I call chronic dissatisfaction. So they're high achievers, they get a lot of stuff done, but they're happy for 5 minutes once they achieve their goals. And then they're like, okay, what's next? Like, I'm ready for more. And they tend to be people who can't stay happy for very long. It's just not in their DNA, right? So there's like this internal, like, agitation, you could say. And sometimes that agitation is like, why am I not moving forward? Why am I not moving ahead? What's taking so long? What's wrong with me? Or it sort of sounds like, hey, I'm trying to go somewhere. Why can't people get on board? What's wrong with them? Am I a bad leader or am I around a bad team? Do I need to fire someone or should I replace myself? And that's the battle that goes on for them. Okay. And then the fourth one is something that it's a term that I made up called slippage. What is slippage? It's when these leaders are so busy working and their heads are so like focused on what they're doing that they let important things slip through the cracks. And so what that means is that maybe they're overeating or maybe they're undereating, maybe they're drinking a little too much. They're definitely not sleeping. They come home and they're so tired, they sit in front of the TV and mindlessly watch Netflix while they're also on their phones at the same time playing a game or whatever. And in their brains, they're still thinking about work. So they have a very hard time being present. And life is going by, right? And they're really not doing a great job of taking care of their lives themselves. And so those are the four departments we see.
I haven't thought about it in that framework, but I would agree with you. And I'm doing a quick rundown my client roster, and I think everyone that I've got is safe to say is reporting one of those or more of those elements in their struggle right now.
Yeah. And and it's usually one is like stronger than another, but oftentimes, like, yesterday I did a presentation and one guy said, yeah, all four of those is what I struggle with, right? I struggle with all of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to camp out on the one you said, talking about can't stay happy for long. They close a big deal or win a big contract or hit a big milestone and they go, okay, what's next? And I always, when I find a client talking about that, I encourage them. I ask them the question, how do you celebrate wins? And is that even on your radar? Do you even think about that, not only for yourself, but for your team?
Yeah.
And, have you been able to actually celebrate a win?
Yeah, that's a good idea. And what's interesting is they might say, I don't perceive that as a win.
Exactly. No, you're 100%. I agree. Because their standard is so high, it's kind of like, and I've heard people verbalize this. Well, that's what I was supposed to do. So, yeah, we won the big deal. That's what I was supposed to do.
That's my job.
That's my job.
That should have happened ages ago.
Yeah.
Right? I know.
Right.
I know
Right.
this. I know the I've had so many of these conversations, so I know it's very, very familiar. It doesn't matter where the client is coming from geographically or what industry they're in or how old they are. It makes no difference. I hear the same thing.
Well, it's interesting to me. We go back to our central theme of leaders being coaches for their teams and thinking about the four areas you just said. So, does the company's CEO who wants to coach the leadership team immediately beneath him, Does he open up that door to say, I don't want you to be isolated. I want you to feel free to speak openly about things? How do you
Well,
begin that process to break down those?
I think that a leader who wants their team members to be open and honest and vulnerable needs to demonstrate that. And and if they're not demonstrating that, then what happens is it's not truly a safe environment.
Right.
But what I see is that that leaders, A, don't have the right coaching skills, and B, they don't have the process in place to coach someone. And so normally what happens, and I'll jump ahead, but like, where do leaders falter when they coach people? Number one is they focus on behaviors instead of beliefs. Like, I want you to change this behavior, so here's what I want you to do. And what they're missing is that action follows thought, and they're not really addressing the source of the problem. They're addressing just the behavior. And while we can create behavior change, what we see is that if we're only changing behavior, we get short-term change. That is not sustainable unless we address the beliefs that accompany those behaviors.
That are
So
driving it. Yeah.
that's thing number one. Thing number two is that a lot of leaders who are trying to coach, they just jump to solution. They say, well, I've done this before. Here's what I want you to do. So they just don't coach, right? They're not actually coaching. They're instructing. They're giving, right? They're just saying, just do this. Here's the solution. We don't need to struggle. We don't need to have this conversation. Do as I say. I already know. Right? So there's no discovery. There's no learning. There's no real growth that's taking place right there. And then the third thing where leaders are making mistakes in their coaching, and you might be a little bit surprised by this, is they confuse compassion and empathy. They confuse the two. And so when you ask a room full of leaders, how important is empathy in your leadership, they'll say it's a 10. We should all be empathetic. And then I say, well, what if I told you that empathy as a leader is actually quite dangerous? And they say, what do you mean? Like, everybody tells us empathy is super important. And I say, well, let's talk about that. Let's define what is empathy. Empathy is not an intellectual activity. It's not an action you take. Empathy is an emotional experience where you put yourself in the shoes of someone else and feel their emotional feelings. You feel what they feel. So imagine you're walking by and you see someone drowning in a pool. How are they feeling? Scared, terrified, panicky, breathless. And if suddenly I have empathy, then I feel scared, breathless, panicky, breathless, right? I feel all of those things. And in that moment, I've disabled myself from being able to help them. Cannot help them. It's almost like I jumped in the pool right beside them and started drowning right with them. So that concept of empathy, while nice, right, isn't actually useful. So let's talk about compassion. If I'm compassionate, I see someone drowning in a pool, I don't keep walking. I stop and I help. Oh my gosh, somebody's drowning. They need my help. But I don't jump in the pool and start drowning with them. I stand solidly on the side of the pool and I reach in and I pull them out. In order for that to happen, I need to have strength and I need to have vision that I have the ability to pull them out, and I need to be able to see them safely outside of the pool. And so what I'm trying to teach leaders is compassion as opposed to empathy, right? Because empathy makes you get stuck in their storyline and
Right.
traps you, and it doesn't help either of you get to a better place.
I like that. And, that correlates with work that I do with a lot of my leaders. I do often, when I have a leader telling me I'm frustrated with my team, I see X, Y, and Z going on, and I need to try to figure out how I can fix this. We get into this realm because the reality for all of us is, I go back to Maslow's hierarchy of need. Every human being that walks through your doors is going to be at some station on that hierarchy for the day. They might have had a horrible fight with their spouse going out the doors, so they've dropped down a rung or two on the ladder of feeling loved, feeling connected, feeling, in a good station. And the challenge with that is all of our good work requires the frontal cortex to operate which is where our critical thinking happens. And the brain scientists tell us when you've dropped down and you're in that survival mode, fight or flight kind of mode, there's a brain chemistry shift and your frontal cortex doesn't get any blood.
Yeah,
so it can't operate. So it's shut down. It's literally shut down. And you're the boss walking by and you go, gee, George, you don't seem yourself. I really need that report by 9 o'clock. Well, that's neither compassionate. It's certainly not empathetic. But I like your argument there for compassion, because compassionately you would say, gee, George, you don't seem yourself. Can you tell me more about what's going on? Do we need to do something? And he may say, well, I just got word that my dad is being rushed to the hospital. And then the boss can say, oh my gosh, well, pack up and get out of here or go to the hospital.
Right. Exactly. And so what you demonstrated right there is an interest and what is going on. And leaders aren't taught to ask those questions. Leaders are afraid to get personal. Leaders are afraid to, ask too many questions. And what I see is like leaders often just jump to conclusions.
Right. Correct. Or maybe they're some form of old school command and control. I don't care what you got going on, buckle down. I need that report or I need that transaction done.
Right.
And equally damaging to the long term.
Right.
Well, Kim, I feel like you and I could probably go on with this for quite a while, but I do think we're about up on time. I need to bring this to an end, land this plane.
Yes, please.
Tell folks the best way to get a hold of you if they want you as a speaker or a coach or guide for this journey.
The best place to reach me is you can email me, kim@frameofmindcoaching.com. But if you're just interested in learning more about what we do, frameofmindcoaching.com is the place to go. We have blogs, podcasts, testimonials, our coaching process, and that, it's a pretty unique way that we coach. But we've been doing it for a long time and super, super impactful process.
Sounds like it. Well, thank you so much for sharing, spending time with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on your show. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You bet. And folks, with that, we're going to try to wrap this up. I do like to remind you that we have a video version of this over on YouTube, a channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. And all of the info that Kim just explained will be in the show notes. So please click down and look for that as you're partaking of this episode. But for now, we are going to shut it down, sign off. Go out there, make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.